Erin, and thank you, Jamie. And hello, everyone. Welcome. It's really an honor to be with you today. Jordan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Charlotta. It's wonderful to be here with you all today. I'm feeling very grateful for this time we get to spend together. As mentioned, part of my background, a big part of my background is that I'm a researcher and scientist, and so I study compassion, mostly study compassion, mindfulness, and compassion. And given this background as a scientist and researcher, I wanted to share a little preview of what I'll be talking about in more depth later in today's workshop. So Charlotta and I think are both going to give sort of a brief introductory remarks about what we'll be covering today, so you sort of know what you're getting yourself into in this time. So mostly what I'll be sharing about today has to do with compassion through a scientific lens, about why and how compassion is a path for cultivating greater resilience in daily life, and especially for those of us that are working sort of more on the front lines. I would say that the front lines of sort of human struggle or pain or suffering. And the main idea, this is sort of a little spoiler alert, so if you want, you could cover your ears and sort of wait for the surprise later, but I'm just joking. The main idea of what I'll be sharing today is that the reason that compassion is a path for cultivating resilience is that it offers us a more conscious stance towards suffering than what is our typical response. I'll explain more what I mean. So one of the ways that I've been reflecting and getting ready for this workshop today is thinking about sort of what are the unique challenges of this time that we're living in terms of the global pandemic. And I've given similar talks on sort of the unique relevance of compassion during these times in particular. And then I was thinking, with this topic and this theme of No More Violence Week, there's actually it's less unique, this pandemic, the challenges that we're facing are maybe less unique in ways that this audience will understand. Generally speaking, I think we do a decent job in society, if we want to put it that way, of sort of sweeping suffering and pain and struggle under the rug. We sort of hide it from plain view. And I think this audience understands that there are sort of chronic forms of suffering in our society that don't tend to make the nightly news, right? Things like how we care for our elderly, or problems of addiction or mental health, or domestic violence and child abuse, right? So these kinds of things, I think, are a little bit more invisible. They tend to be. And during this global pandemic, I think there's been a bit more lifting of the rug. There's been a bit more awareness or visibility of these more chronic kinds of suffering within society than may be typical. So it's been a little bit harder, I think, to sort of hide some of these forms of suffering. But I think a big part of what compassion teaches us is that suffering is happening kind of beneath the surface of people's lives, whether we see it or not, whether it's in plain view or not, right? Everyone is dealing with some kind of invisible struggle, often, unfortunately, more than one sort of invisible struggle. And I think you all probably get that if you're here today. So for those of us that are more empathically attuned to suffering, or work sort of more directly with human struggle of various kinds on a day-to-day basis, there's this possibility of our empathy response being more chronically activated. Okay. So research shows that kind of exposure to human suffering in various kinds, or working with those who are going through a fair amount of struggle, there's this possibility of empathy being more chronically activated. And what research suggests is that empathy kind of has a limit in terms of its benefits. It helps us to a certain degree, and then if we have too much empathy, there's this possibility of excess empathy, or this possibility of empathy being too chronically engaged in ways that are detrimental to our health and well-being personally, but also decrease the likelihood that we can engage in effective helping behavior over the long term. So this leads to things like personal distress or overwhelm, different kinds of exhaustion that we'll get into in more detail later. And then over the long term, this can contribute to burnout in our careers and in our daily lives. So it's exactly here that we find the relevance of compassion for cultivating resilience. And so I'm returning here to this sort of main idea that I'm going to be sharing with you all today in greater detail when we get to the science portion. And that's that compassion is offering us a more conscious stance towards suffering than what is typical. And what's typical tends to be a sort of natural empathic response to suffering. And the thing about empathy that's really key is that empathy tends to be relatively subconscious. So it's something we experience as happening to us. Whereas compassion is, by definition, a conscious experience, and it's something we can learn how to grow and train. And that's a big part of what we'll be covering today. And so as we become more conscious, or because compassion is a more conscious response, it's a more resourced response. When we encounter suffering in the world, it's less likely then to catch us off guard. It's less likely to overwhelm us, and it's less likely to contribute to this kind of exhaustion and fatigue over the long term. So I look forward to getting into more detail with this later today in my science piece. But hopefully you can sort of get a preview now about this compassion being a more conscious response to suffering, and that's what we're going to cover today. All right, back to you, Charlotta.
Thanks, Jordan. So again, hello, everyone. And I wanted to actually begin with a note of thanks for the work you do in the world. And when Jamie was sharing with us why you're putting on this week of programs, No More Violence Week, and the work that many of you do, I was deeply struck by the power of what you do and the incredible contribution to society and to your communities and to our world. So I want to acknowledge you for the work you do, knowing that it's not easy, but it's so necessary. And again, thank you for including us in this very beautiful week in the sense of what you're aiming to do. So what I'd like to do now is share a little bit about compassion, kind of from the other side of compassion. We tend to think of compassion for others, which is obviously so key to compassion, but also the part of compassion that is about self-compassion. So I'll step back a little bit first. I was contemplating this idea of No More Violence Week, which is really a vision, I imagine, for a communities with no more violence, a world with no more violence, families with no more violence. And really, in thinking about this, contemplating what does this mean, it made me think about the nature of aggression. And when we think about aggression, obviously there's initially that sense of outward aggression and all the incredible harm and pain that aggression, human aggression, causes to others. But there's also maybe a more subtle layer of aggression, which is internal aggression. And I would say often it's the case that outer aggression has an inner component to it, an inner aggression towards ourselves. And that really for all of us as humans, we have to deal at some level with aggression that we have towards ourselves, or unkindness towards ourselves, sort of a seed of aggression that's within us. And so when we're talking about compassion and how do we create more compassionate relationships, more compassionate communities, we're also talking about how do we cultivate compassion and kindness within ourselves. So that inner component. And so No More Violence is really, it seems to me, also an invitation to look at how we heal the root of aggression or unkindness within us. So when we look at those of you gathered here, what does unkindness towards yourself, what does that really mean? And I'm guessing it, can be quite subtle. But what I'm inviting you in this contemplation of self-compassion to do is to also look at how are you perhaps unkind towards yourself? Where are you judgmental of yourself, critical of yourself, or uncaring? And I think there's a particular note or tendency in those who are in some kind of helping profession or healing profession. There can be a tendency to ignore yourself, to override your own needs or push through obstacles in order to meet the needs of others. And that's wonderful, right? It's this wonderful impulse to want to do good, to be helpful to others, to aid others, to be of assistance to others. But where underneath that do we miss perhaps also some care and basic kindness for ourselves? And so when we talk about the resilience of compassion, part of that is also how do we cultivate self-compassion in our well-being, self-compassion towards ourselves, or compassion towards ourselves. So when we look at compassion overall, I like to think of it as a continuum. There's compassion for others and there's compassion for self. And really the two kind of go together. They're like this interweaving loop that support and inspire and invigorate each other. And we can come at compassion from the outward focused side of compassion or from the inward focused side of compassion. So we know, for example, or I'll use as a personal example, I'm a mother. And so I'll have those days when I'm really kind of concerned with some kind of personal worry, something at work or financial stuff. And then when my kid needs me, it's actually an incredible sense of relief because I get to care for someone else. I get to turn towards someone else and in some ways forget about the things I've been worrying about myself. And so compassion for others does make us feel better. I'm guessing you know that also in your work and why you do what you do, because that compassion for other beings fulfills us, makes us feel the value and meaning of our lives. But it can go the other way too, right? That when we cultivate compassion for ourselves, a basic stance of kindness or awareness for whatever is happening within us, we're more resourced to be able to extend that care and that kindness to others. So it's almost like in befriending ourselves truly, we create a platform from which we can offer greater kindness and compassion to others. So again, this sort of weaving, right, and continuum of compassion for self and compassion for other. So I wanted to say a little bit more about what self-compassion is not, because sometimes I think we might shy away from self-compassion because there's a misconception of what we're talking about. So I wanted to speak to some of those right off the bat. So when I'm inviting you into an exploration of self-compassion, this is not an invitation towards self-pity, right? Self-pity or any kind of pity is really disempowering. It's in disempowering of ourselves when we pity ourselves. It's disempowering of someone else when we pity them, right? Self-pity is a kind of feeling sorry for ourselves, making ourselves into an object. And we sort of hunker in, we get closed off in self-pity. Self-compassion is also not self-gratification. Self-compassion isn't about just trying to feel better in the moment that we don't feel good. We've probably all done this, that you get home at night and you're tired or you're in a bad mood and you're like, you know what, I'm just going to treat myself to that whole pint of ice cream. And it tastes really good, right? For that like 20 minutes when you're gulping it, or half hour, maybe if you're watching something, right? And then about an hour later, you've got a stomach ache. And the next morning you have that sugar hangover, and it actually wasn't self-compassionate at all. So when we're talking about self-compassion, we're not talking about that momentary self-gratification or that short-term short-term gratification. Self-compassion is also not the same as self-esteem. So self-esteem is great, but often self-esteem is based on accomplishments. And certainly I would hope that all of us at the end of a long day When we get home, turn off the computer, can have a moment of recognizing what we've accomplished that day and actually taking it in and valuing it. But self-compassion actually is not based on what we've achieved or not achieved. In fact, I would almost say that self-compassion is more called for on those days and in those times when we feel things haven't gone so well, when we haven't shown up the way we thought we should or could or might have. In those times when we haven't achieved or haven't accomplished, that's really a call for deep self-compassion. And then finally, self-compassion is not self-absorption, right? We might have this sense like, self-compassion, it's all about me, and this isn't really, compassion's about you. And so I want to say it's both. It's you and me and you and me and us and us and us and us. It's all of it. So self-compassion is not about self-involvement. So then what is it? What is self-compassion? And I'm going to ask you this question again in a moment for you personally to contemplate. So this is a little seed to have you start thinking for yourself what this means for you. But I'd say self-compassion is about cultivating a basic attitude of acknowledgement, acknowledging what's happening for you, paying attention, turning that lens of awareness, of mindfulness. What's really going on for me? What's happening? Am I frustrated today? Am I feeling weary today? Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling confused? Am I feeling angry? Hopeless? So self-compassion begins with acknowledgement, right where we're at. And then it's about kindness. It's about creating a basic view of kindness and gentleness towards whatever we've recognized is happening. It's like developing a basic friendliness towards ourselves, wherever we're at. So in some ways, another way I like to think of self-compassion or compassion generally, but it's about creating more space in our experience, particularly around painful experiences. Jordan was talking about suffering, right? So key, like recognizing where's our suffering, where's our pain, and creating space of awareness around it. So it's almost like, again, speaking as a mama, and those of you who are parents, it's like the embrace. It's like that soft embrace of our child, not because we're going to fix, but just we're holding them. So can we offer ourselves that embrace? Like, it's okay. There's space for this, whatever is happening. And then I think what happens in that bigger space that we create in self-compassion, one is we're not overrun by our emotions. When we create space for anger to be there, to be recognized, and to feel a basic friendliness even towards our anger, then we're not overrun by the anger, right? We've given it it's like letting a wild dog run outside, right? We give it space, give it some space to be. And I would also suggest that in creating more space around wherever we're at, which is what self-compassion is, we're actually allowing ourselves to be more fully right where we are, feel what we're feeling, not trying to push it away or make it something else. And so in that opening, and I don't mean to use corny language here, but it's a kind of opening of the heart, right? Opening of our minds, opening of our awareness. We also create more space for others, to open our heart to others, to bring others into our awareness. It's almost like when we connect with our own vulnerability, with our own sadness, with our own grief, it becomes like an opening, like a portal for connecting with others, with the sadness that's part of humanity, that we share, that all of us have sadness, all of us have grief, all of us have tenderness. And so this very personal experience that we might be having actually begins, when we go into it, begins to open us to something we might call shared humanity or common humanity. So suddenly I'm not looking at you as other, but oh, there's another human being whose heart also breaks, who's also confused at times, who's also angry. And that's compassion then, right? That's the ground of vast compassion. Some sense of our shared humanity. So I thank you, Erin, for naming that we're in Boulder. And I had my own, I'll just share briefly my own experience in terms of this shooting. I realized initially it was almost like I shut myself off from it. It was like a conceptual, it was like a story, because I had the fortune of I wasn't there, and no one I knew had been there or was killed. And I could see how myself sort of retracted a little bit into like the news story of it. And then a couple of days ago, I took my kids, because we used to live there. It used to be our local grocery store when my kids were little. So we went down and we paid our respects, and we brought flowers, and we just walked that whole strip. And suddenly then, in being there and thinking about the stories, the mother who worked at the store and whose son worked at the store, and the son died and the mother survived, thinking of these details being there, suddenly I could feel like my heart starting to crack. And I let myself, just in these last days, I let myself just cry, just be in the sadness. And what started happening in that was actually a much deeper sense of connection to my community, to those affected, to all of you actually thinking of knowing I was going to spend this time with you today, and the vision for this gathering of no more violence. But the way in was actually very personal. It was giving my own experience the space to just be in it, not wallow in it, but acknowledge it and be in it. And so this is this view of self-compassion as actually profound self-care, of attending of ourselves, and an honoring of wherever we find ourselves in a given moment, in a given situation. And that leaning into it, we can actually tap into a greater resilience that we call the resilience of compassion, which is the resilience of our common humanity. Like, look at all these other beings. Most of you are just names on my screen, but those of you who I can see, and also the names, like, here we are together. We're doing this together in our pain and in our hope, in our effort, in our failing, in our joy. There's incredible resilience in that. Okay, so I wanted to end this little piece with just a short practice, and it's a practice called compassionate abiding, and it's very simple. It works with the breath. So if you've been sitting for a long time today and just want to like shake out your body, or even, get up and just feel the blood moving through your limbs again, go for it. And I'll just very briefly guide this. So I'm going to invite you to, just in this moment, tap into something that's hurting you, irritating you, worrying you. Something you'd probably rather, if you could just have an on and off switch turn off. Like, I don't want to be feeling that. I don't want to be aware of that confusion, or that pain, or that sadness, or that anger, or that frustration, or that irritation. Maybe it's just tiredness, overwhelm, anxiety. And just take a moment to this moment of just acknowledging like what's not so well within you right now. And then as you breathe in, just let yourself become more aware of that. Let the in-breath be an acknowledgement of whatever difficulty you're feeling in this moment. And as you exhale, the exhale is just giving it space, a bigger field to be in. Breathing in, feel whatever it is you're feeling. Feel it in your body. You don't have to think about the story of it, why you're feeling it, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, whether you're right in feeling it or not. Let this narrative go. Just let the in-breath bring awareness to the feeling. Be with it. And as you exhale, just create more space around it. Initially, it might feel like you're intensifying this feeling because you're bringing awareness to it. But it's an awareness of basic kindness towards yourself. So we breathe in, breathing in kindness and the awareness of this difficulty. Just feeling it as fully as you can, being with it. And exhaling, feeling a sense of space, spaciousness. I'll do this just for a couple more breaths. Okay, thank you. So I told you a little while ago I was going to invite you to think about what self-compassion means to you. So a couple of questions I invite you to contemplate. I'll put them in the chat as well. So one question is, how would you define compassion? Oh, sorry, that I shouldn't have. Anyway, it should be, how would you define compassion and self-compassion? What do these mean to you? How would you define compassion and self-compassion in your own words? And then here, let me correct the typo. It's irritating me. I'm gonna be compassionate towards myself and re-chat this to you. Okay, how would you define compassion and self-compassion? How do you experience self-compassion? What's your own relationship to it? And how do you experience compassion, either as giving it to others or receiving it? So I'm going to give you a couple minutes just on your own. So we'll just think or reflect, write maybe. And then we'll have some time in small groups to share with each other, and then also share out in the bigger group. So again, our questions are, how would you define compassion and self-compassion? How do you experience self-compassion? And how do you experience compassion generally for others, either as giving it or receiving it? So let's take until, I've got 33 on my clock, so let's take till 35 and just think about it. Yeah, feel free also to write in the chat. It's nice to connect, and then we'll have some time in small groups after that, Jamie. So we'll do groups of 3 for 10 minutes after this. Hmm. Beautiful. Some wonderful things coming in already. I'll just read what's been shared in the chat. Kindness and presence. Self-compassion is unconditional acceptance and gratefulness towards myself. Yeah, great. That unconditionality. Roxandra, is that how I say your name? Beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Unconditional and the gratefulness, right? Gratitude. Beautiful. Loving myself even with my faults. Kindness, understanding, and acceptance. Compassion is grace and forgiveness shown with love and empathy. Self-compassion would be the same, just directed at myself, at oneself. Grace and forgiveness. Beautiful. Respecting the human dignity of others. I think I'm very compassionate towards others, but self-compassion is very difficult. Yes, thank you, Cindy. So I'm going to invite you in these breakouts just to share with each other, you know, some of what you've shared here. How do you define these? What's easy? What's not? What's it like to get real compassion and what's not genuine compassion? You know, it feels like someone's just feeling sorry for you. So let's go ahead and do that whenever you're ready, Jamie.
All
Thank
right,
you.
here we go. This is more breakout rooms than I've ever done. So fingers crossed, here we go.
So I was the only one in my breakout room. I was wondering if you could send me to a new one.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I was trying to watch for that.
Oh, that's okay.
Do you know which room you were in?
It was 15 and someone was in there and then they left. So I'm not
Okay,
sure.
I'm going to
Yeah.
check you right now. Here you go.
Thanks.
You bet.
This is Shelley McLean. I was the only one in room 29.
All right. Sorry, I was trying to get down there and check yours. I apologize. Do you want me to move you to a different one then that has more folks in it?
Sure.
All right, here you go.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay. We're back. I'll share this with you. This is one of my like Zoom science fiction ideas, is like, what if you go into a breakout and then you come back and you're in a different meeting? Like suddenly there are all these other people and they're talking about something completely different. Like, you know, how do you make Jello or something? And so anyway, I'm always really excited when I'm back in the same world with you. So yeah, would love to just open it up either in the chat or, you know, I don't know, we can probably play the crazy game of unmuting. Maybe that'll work, or just to see what came up in sharing with each other and thinking about this. Love to hear a little bit more. And there was something from Mandy from before we went into breakouts. I'll just read that. Caring for oneself, as well as accepting my faults and loving myself through it. And compassion is caring directed towards others and the realization that other people have feelings as well. Anyone else?
In our group, we talked about Robert and Mary both work with inmates, and you know how if you treat them with compassion and you know, they seem to act better. And I work with high-risk families, and I'm on the board of directors for our Early Childhood Coalition. And part of that is raising readers and trying to get families to read to their children when they're young. And it didn't dawn on me until I read a study that reading to your child helps to build empathy, because they get into the story and put themselves in the shoes of the story person. And once you can build empathy in a child, I don't think that that's really going to go away once they get to be an adult.
Beautiful. Thank you, Cindy. So much in there. Thank you. Stephanie, you were unmuted a moment ago. Do you want to share?
Sure. I was just going to add that my partner, Julie, and I, we were talking about how it's a lot easier in our minds to exhibit compassion toward others, and self-compassion feels a lot more difficult. And yet self-compassion might be a lot more important and allow us to do better compassion toward others.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. And I want to name here, Shelley wrote, thank you for this. Self-compassion for me feels like a fine line with selfishness. Yes, and this is, I think, you know, when I was talking about what self-compassion is not, why I brought up, you know, it's not self-absorption, because I think we can steer away from it because of exactly what you're talking about, Shelley. Like, is it just selfishness? So what, you know, I would say that the self-compassion piece that makes it different from selfishness is that it actually does create a space in which we connect more with others from a place of genuineness. And our conversation was really lovely with Cassie and Sandra around genuineness was one of the things that came up, of being genuine with those that we're working with, and that people can read us. And I think that genuineness also comes from that self-compassion, but then extends, allows us to be with others in a better way. But thanks for bringing that up. Okay, maybe I'll just read these last two, and then Jordan, I'll turn it to you. So Cassie also wrote, I would think that showing compassion would reduce defensiveness, leading to less undesirable behaviors. Yeah, that's beautiful. And then Beth wrote, self-compassion is something I neglect. Compassion towards others is usually in the forefront of my mind. So beautiful that it's on the forefront and we can include ourselves in all of humanity. Well, thank you for this short exploration, and Jordan will continue with you.
Thank you, Charlotta. Yeah, I'll be going into the science now, and we're mostly going to be focused in mine on compassion for others. So one view that we have in our compassion training at Naropa is that it's important to work on both. It's important to cultivate greater self-compassion, and it's also important to work with, even if we are someone who sort of finds compassion for others to come quite natural, it's important to grow more conscious of that and to cultivate a more conscious relationship with it. And so as I'll be covering now, that has a lot to do with compassion training and also transforming our empathy into compassion. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. See if I can locate my PowerPoint. Here we go. So you probably saw the title of today's workshop, Transforming Empathy into Compassion from Fatigue to Resilience. And the main idea that I said that I would be sharing about earlier is the way that compassion helps because it's a more conscious response to suffering, whether within ourselves or others. And when I say suffering, it's a really broad term. It encompasses even things like physical, it encompasses big things like physical pain, but also encompasses just kind of discomfort or a lack of ease in our daily life, kind of difficulty with relationships and so on. So all sorts of things fall under that category. And before I get into sharing about the research itself, I thought it would be good to do a little self-check-in. So this is going to rely on a research tool that is used to study compassion and its relevance to things like mental health. And I thought we often find there's value in sharing this with people to allow for their own kind of exploration of kind of ideas we have about compassion to begin with before we get into the science. So this is the little self-assessment here. It's divided into 3 different sections. You don't actually need to sort of score this for yourself. We're not going to go tally our results and compare them to some kind of norm or something like that. This is really meant to be a kind of lens for you to reflect on your feelings about compassion before I get into the rest of today. So 0 here on the scale would be this isn't not at all true for me, or 4 would be this is extremely true for me. So why don't you just take some time and read through these statements and see if any of them jump out to you as being something where it feels like it's bringing something up for you, like, yeah, I do think that about compassion, or this is a sort of concern of mine. It's always tough to know how exactly long to give people to read through these, but hopefully you found one of these statements something to connect with in it. This scale is these items come from a larger scale that is actually called the fears of compassion. And so it's divided into 3 parts. The first part at the top, I'll go back to it for a second. So this is fears of compassion for others. And so there's fears related to that, right? Like, I worry if I become too compassionate, vulnerable people can be drawn to me and drain my emotional resources. Almost a kind of energy vampirism fear there, right? So this is fear of compassion for others. Fear of compassion from others is an interesting one, that we might have some fear or some concerns or discomfort in receiving care from others. And this is actually maybe more common than you might think. When people are kind and compassionate toward me, I feel anxious or embarrassed. How many of us can relate to that? There's a vulnerability, right? In order to allow ourselves to receive care from others, we first have to acknowledge that there's something that is in need of care, that there's some kind of humanness there. And then the third is about self-compassion, which Charlotta was just talking about. Let's see here. I fear that if I become kinder and less self-critical to myself, then my standards will drop. How many of us can relate to that idea that somehow if we're kinder to ourselves, we're going to sort of not be cracking the whip constantly or something, staying on task, right? So hopefully, it's not super strong for you, these fears of compassion. And if you've studied compassion in the past, you may sort of score 0 on all of these things for reasons I'll get into in just a moment. But I think this does raise interesting questions about why it is we might fear compassion. This brings up things for people to scale and brings up some questions and so on. So I'm just going to pause briefly and see if there's anything. I'm not able to see the chat. Is there anything coming in that feels pressing that I should address?
Jordan is saying one person asked if they can have this assessment. And another individual said they weren't able to see the last one. You just need to maximize your screen.
This is the same view I'm always using. So the last one, just so you can know, and then yes, we could share this. So I can send it to you, Jamie, maybe, and you can share it out to the attendees, and then you'll get the full scale too. So that'll be good. It says, I fear that if I start to feel the sense of loss and grief, right? So this fear that somehow a little bit of self-compassion is going to sort of open the floodgates, right, to kind of all of this pain or loss that might be within us. So the good news is, moving forward, I have very little on the bottom of the screen, so I don't think stuff will be cut off, but I'm not sure. It does look like I'm sharing the full screen here. Yeah, so this raises the question, though, I think, why might people fear compassion? And another interesting thing to say about this is that this line of research suggests that people don't just passively resist compassion in the sense of avoiding it in one way or another, but there can actually be different kinds of active resistance of compassion, that people may really not want to experience self-compassion. They really may not want to experience receiving compassion from others. And what seems to be a variable that's highly correlated with this is sort of the strength of the self-critic. And it turns out that self-criticism can be thought of as a kind of avoidance of self-compassion in a way, and avoidance of having more contact and connection with our vulnerability and our shared humanity. So I think there's many reasons why people might fear compassion, and research backs that up. People have fear generally of affiliative emotions. There's kind of fear of things that involve a sense of warmth or care in general. But today I want to focus on a factor that I think might relate to fears of compassion, kind of regardless of one's personal background or history or childhood or whatever. And it relates to the rest of the talk. And it actually has to do with some confusion about what exactly compassion is. And I'm an emotion researcher and scientist by training. And so I know that emotions are something that involve our concepts. And so when we have kind of conceptual confusion about an emotion, that can lead to a kind of experiential confusion about it as well. So let's say that we don't fully understand what self-compassion is, or let's say that we think one way or another that self-compassion is a form of selfishness. Then it's possible that in the pursuit of self-compassion, as we're learning it or trying it out in our experience, we may engage in some kind of pseudo self-compassion, something that's not actually consistent with how science might understand self-compassion, or about how traditions that have been working with compassion for thousands of years understand compassion as well. So I'm going to focus on that here. And so, put simply, compassion is not the same as empathy. And as Charlotta already gave us a longer list, which I really appreciate, self-compassion is not, and then we have self-pity, self-gratification, but, I just put selfishness here. So this is pretty clear, the research on this kind of distinction. And so we're going to go into this, mostly focus on this first one here, that compassion and empathy are not the same thing. Okay, and so our goal for the science piece is really to get clearer at a conceptual level about what exactly compassion is, and to distinguish that from other related experiences, and especially the experience of empathy. But we're also going to work within our experience. So we're going to work at both a conceptual level and an experiential level to try and disentangle, especially compassion and empathy, both at this conceptual level and this experiential level. So we have this greater potential of not only understanding, conceptually understanding compassion with greater precision, but also when we go to experience compassion, when we encounter suffering within ourselves or others in the future, there's potential for greater clarity or precision of feeling that experience and leaning into it. This being said, Charlotta and I had built in some time for a brief bio break, if people might need that, or a brief break for people to stretch a little bit. And I realize we could just kind of press on, but there's a little bit of compassion in this, kind of creating a little space in our time together in this workshop. So why don't we take a few minutes now. It's 1:01 here. If we could come back at 1:05, and so if you need to turn off your camera if it's on, get up, stretch, move around a little bit, just kind of get some energy back, or use the restroom, and we'll come back at 1:05 and I'll continue with this lecture portion. And coming back when we're ready. Back to this topic of disentangling empathy and compassion. So I'll get started here. Won't get too deep into content in case people are needing a bit more time. And so we're going to explore this question kind of through the lens of these, or explore this topic through the lens of these three questions here. What's the kind of experiential or real-time difference between empathy and compassion? And then what are the differences in empathy, compassion further downstream? So apart from the experience itself, how is it that maybe experiencing a moment of empathy versus a moment of compassion might impact our well-being over the longer term? And then this last question here, I think, to me is one of the most interesting ones. I think the answer may be obvious from where I'm coming from, but can training in compassion lessen empathy's downsides while preserving its upsides? Okay, so I'm going to argue that yes, it's possible. And so compassion is really, in some sense, many times a better alternative for us than just staying in a place of empathy. So we'll start with this one. And for each one, we'll explore some of the science around these questions. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do to understand the difference between empathy and compassion is a bit of definition, right? And so empathy is a term that is used in a lot of different ways in the scientific literature. So it's important to get clear about which version of empathy we're talking about here. There's a form of empathy called mind perception, experience sharing, mentalizing. But the one that people are referring to most often when they use this term here of experience sharing. So this is this tendency that human beings have. It's sort of extraordinary if we really think about it, to take on the states of others around us. So we pick up on bodily cues from others. And so depending on what they're expressing through their body and through their facial expressions, we pick up on those things and we internalize them in a sense. We mimic them in our own experience, often beneath the surface of conscious awareness. And we come to be in a state that's a little bit closer to whatever it is that other person is experiencing. And so this is such a subconscious process that it tends to occur automatically for us. So if we're walking down the street and we see someone with who's sad, maybe they're crying, they recently got out of a sad situation or something, we see that person, they're a complete stranger, it's possible that we ourselves will pick up on some of that sadness. So this is also sometimes called emotional contagion. But in the territory of empathy, it's a little bit more nuanced and deeper than just catching the emotions of others. So as I said, this is a process that tends to occur subconscious. So we're kind of hardwired for this experience of simulating the bodily states of others and the facial expressions of others in ways that end up resulting in us experiencing those states ourselves. And this is going to be really key for our understanding of the distinction between empathy and compassion. So if I show you this picture here, there may be a possibility of sort of automatic resonance with what this person's going through. And it's difficult to not feel that resonance for most people if they keep their eyes on the screen, keep looking at this photo. And similarly, if I show you this photo, right, it may be difficult to not somehow resonate with the feelings of this girl, feel a sense of happiness as well. It's a little less intense with photographs, right? But the idea is just give you this felt sense that this is kind of happening to us. It's an experience that we sort of passively receive this experience sharing. So then a way of thinking about the distinction between empathy and compassion really simply is that empathy is more about feeling with others. So through this process of experience sharing, we're feeling with what others are feeling, and we're taking on the states of others kind of at this automatic level. And we're going to make this distinction and say that compassion is more about feeling for others. Okay, so I'll get into what that means. Really, it's more about feeling for those that are suffering. That's what it's going to be about. And it's often experienced as a kind of natural care and affection for others. But we can also orient this natural care and affection, this feeling toward ourselves when we are the ones who are receiving compassion. But compassion really involves three components. So it's a bit more of a complex experience than empathy. Empathy is kind of hardwired into us, this experience sharing, and it tends to happen at that subconscious automatic level. So it doesn't really require our conscious engagement to occur. Whereas in compassion, we first have to grow more aware that suffering is happening in our experience. And so I said earlier, suffering is quite a broad term here. It can mean things like big suffering with an S, like really challenging situations or some kind of pain, physical pain that we're living with, but can also be little suffering with a small s, like it could be in this moment, are your shoulders being held up tight, and are you uncomfortable in your seat? Or are you feeling some stress about the next thing on your list that you need to do? So in compassion, we're just growing more aware of the various sources of discomfort in our experience, and we're actually being willing to look at those things. So that's the first step that's making compassion a more conscious experience, is that we're more consciously turning toward and noticing that in our experience. The second piece is this feeling for the one who is suffering. So we're going to get into this more. There's this natural affection and care that we can come to experience. This is the feeling dimension of compassion. It's probably the one that we think of when we think of what compassion is. We think of this feeling component of compassion, kind of warmth. And then the third aspect is the motivation or intention to alleviate the suffering if we can. So whether it's in our own suffering or the suffering of others, through this feeling, through this experience of compassion, it comes along with this kind of inner readiness, this motivation or intention to do something to alleviate the suffering if possible. And if it's not possible to act to alleviate suffering, this wish can still be there. We can still wish for others to be free from this suffering. So that's the kind of caring component of compassion. So even though I depicted these three as sort of in a linear sequence, 1, 2, 3 here, I have this cycle here because they're really more cyclical. They kind of feed into one another. As we grow more aware of suffering, we have this opportunity to feel more and to feel this greater motivation to alleviate suffering as well. Okay, so we have this cognitive component of compassion, this affective component, this feeling aspect, and then a motivational component. So sometimes when people first hear about compassion in this way, through our training program and so on, they say, wow, this is kind of complex. This experience of compassion is a little complex. So it's important to note that compassion is very natural to us. It's something innate within us. And so even though there are these different aspects to it, and when we're first trying it out in these kind of practices and so on, it can feel like these are different sort of separate pieces of compassion. Ultimately, what we're working toward is a more sort of holistic experience of compassion in which these three things are very much sort of yoked together within our lived experience. And that's a feeling that should be or will be probably familiar to us because it's innate. And so we're just working to grow that experience. Okay, so I said that we'd be working at both conceptual and experiential levels. So we're going to try out a more experiential definition of compassion now. So having sort of considered these different conceptual components or these different components of compassion from a conceptual angle, we're going to see if we can experience compassion, this definition of compassion in our experience, in a way that makes it distinct from empathy. Okay, so for this exercise, if you're willing to engage in this with us, I'm going to invite you to get into a posture or a position where you feel comfortable trying this out for a little bit. Mostly people like to sort of sit a little more upright, a little more intentionally for a kind of exercise or activity like this. You don't have to close your eyes. There will be some visual cues on the screen, but you're also welcome to close your eyes, and I'll provide enough guidance verbally as we go. And the first step of this, we're going to kind of prepare a little bit for this experience of compassion, is going to be to identify something within our experience that sparks a kind of inner warmth for us. So I invite you to take a moment to think about something, an image or a word. Maybe it's a gesture, like putting your hand on your heart. but something that helps spark a sense of inner warmth for you. And I apologize if you're hearing in the background, there's some construction noise happening outside, so hopefully it doesn't get too loud. Something that sparks inner warmth for you. So I'll give you an example so that you feel like whatever is coming up for you isn't too silly, okay? Because what sparks inner warmth for me is thinking about puppies or kittens, okay? So research suggests actually that people find it a little bit easier to feel a natural affection, to feel this kind of inner warmth for pets and animals than they might for other people. And so sometimes I say that's a little sad to think about, and yet it seems to be true, and we can work to extend this kind of natural affection and care as well. So this puppy on the left here is my brother's new dog, now older than this photo. This is when my brother first got this dog. And so when I think about that puppy, I just feel this natural affection and warmth within myself. So in research terms, you know, if this feels a little cheesy or silly or whatever, in research terms, we call this proactive emotion generation. So what we're doing by finding our spark, something that sparks inner warmth for us, is we're trying to find that thing that allows us to self-generate warmth. So proactively generate an emotional state within us. And this is going to be important for that feeling for component. If you are, one last thing here is if you are struggling to identify something that sort of readily calls to mind or sparks warmth for you, no big deal. Hopefully you can continue to work with this through your through the coming days and weeks and kind of see if there's something that you encounter in daily life. Oh, I noticed that. Wow, I just, you know, had this experience with my child or loved one, and I felt immediately that kind of spark that Jordan was talking about. And so this is a process of self-discovery. Okay, so now we're going to rely on that. We can drop that for a moment, and we're going to use that in a little bit to kind of take a little shortcut into the experience of compassion. But the first thing that we're going to do in this practice is we're going to do that first step of greater awareness of suffering. So I invite you to reflect on a recent news story that you might have heard, something that's maybe not too big. There's not too much pain and struggle in it, but something that recently sort of naturally brought up some feelings of empathy for you, feeling for those who are going through something, some kind of struggle. So go ahead and take a moment to recall something that you read in the news or heard about on the news, or maybe through a friend. And allow yourself to feel what it's like to take in that pain, that struggle, to resonate with that, to feel with it. So this is this first step. There's a kind of courage of compassion, where we're willing to look. We're willing to stay with. And often what happens at this point with empathy is it kind of just stays here. So we might be walking down the street and we see a homeless person or a houseless person, and we have that initial hit of empathy for their situation, for what they're going through. And then we feel that within our experience and we don't quite know what to do with it. So it just kind of hangs out there and bounces around. And it may even lead to some kind of inner conflict that we have of, do I offer this person some money today, or don't I? Or do I offer them some food, or don't I? So there's this kind of inner conflict that might come up as a result of just experiencing empathy alone. Okay, so we're going to build from the foundation of empathy for suffering now into a more compassion related experience. So this is when we bring in the spark. Okay, so now you can drop thinking about that news story, thinking about the pain, suffering of others, and now call to mind again that thing that brings about warmth for you. Or if it's putting your hand on your heart. And just allowing yourself again to tune in to that natural warmth and affection. Okay, now grounded in this place, resting in this place, steady from this sense of warmth, we're going to allow ourselves to bring back in that news story that we were thinking about and see if we can't extend this warmth. Hold that pain, hold that suffering that we were calling to mind in this container of warmth and affection. So you might even feel this warmth kind of radiating out from you toward those affected by this situation. And this is what's meant by feeling for those who are suffering. Okay, so from this natural warmth place of care, this is an other-oriented feeling state. And we can allow that to grow. And then the last sequence of compassion training, of practicing compassion, and this is a key part of compassion becoming more conscious, is practicing it, is to cultivate this inner wish, this readiness, this motivation. And so we often use a wish for that in compassion practice. And so the wish might be something like, may you be free from this suffering. So we could repeat this silently to ourselves. From this place of warmth and natural affection and care, thinking about those suffering. And just touching into this wish for them to be free from that suffering, even if we don't understand how that's possible. It's not about trying to fix or change someone. It's just about wishing for what's best for them over the long term. Okay, so hopefully this gave you more of an experiential sense of what it's like to experience compassion and why it is that compassion may be a more conscious experience than empathy. That empathy, when we think about the news story, it sort of happens to us. It's kind of energetic receiving, right? There's somatically sort of a feeling of receiving information or the energy of others, right? The feelings that others are having. Whereas through compassion, we're just starting with that foundation, but we're quickly transforming that into a more conscious experience of a wish for their well-being and a readiness to act, if it's possible, to alleviate that suffering in a skillful way. And sometimes it's not possible, and so it stays at that wish level. Okay, so this brings to mind the fact that a lot of times people think about compassion like in terms of, I'll put these both on the screen. They think about compassion in terms of just emotional connection. So I have this photo here of two people engaged in conversation with each other. And there's this possibility then of, too much compassion. And then I might lose myself in the course of conversation. I might lose my sense of self in this kind of connection with others. And that is actually more akin to the experience of empathy. What research suggests is that compassion has within it a natural boundary. There's a sense of self-other distinction that's preserved more in compassion experience. And we talk about this sometimes in terms of emotional containment. So we feel connection to those that are suffering, but we also are able to differentiate our own experience from the experience of others. So another way of thinking about this is that we have that sort of social glue aspect where we're able to experience the benefits of emotions that help us connect with others, but we also have a kind of emotional autonomy. The self-other differentiation is maintained and actually supported through compassion. So sometimes people fear compassion because they think, oh, I'm already so much on this side of the spectrum. I'm already so much kind of other-oriented that I'm fearful of compassion because I'm worried about losing my sense of self. I'm worried about the sort of collapse of self-other boundary or something like that. And what I need more boundaries, right? And what research suggests is that compassion actually has this sense of natural boundary within it. And so it's more in the middle of this spectrum where we can experience both connection and containment simultaneously. So through training in this, it's actually a pretty profound balance of those two things, okay? So another way of thinking about this, I like this little GIF here, is that we can regulate our empathy through compassion. We can dynamically dial up or down our empathy experience as needed in order to facilitate or find this balance between connection on one hand and autonomy on the other. And that balance is really essential, especially if we're working in more crisis situations or we're working with those who are really going through a lot of struggle. Finding that balance point is what allows us to be most effective in our compassion. Okay, so this is another way of saying that compassion is a more conscious experience. A more conscious experience is a more regulated experience. There's more control, there's more choice and flexibility in how we engage with it. So we have now conceptually and experientially a sense of the distinction. Let's take a look at some of the neuroscience on this topic. What does that have to say about the distinction between empathy and compassion? So this is a study. I'll take it off the screen just for a second because we get distracted by the pictures of the brain and so on. This is a study that involved scanning people's brains as they observed videos of others who were going through a really profound kind of struggle. And so these were real videos of real human suffering. And the participants in this study were asked to watch these videos and allow themselves to experience empathy for those that were in the videos. And then the group was trained in compassion in ways similar to how we're all experiencing some compassion practices today, except that they went through it. Oh, it looks like someone might have shared a different screen. Are you all seeing that as well? Yeah. Let me see if I can reshare.
Karen, I think you might have bumped a button. There we go. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So, so they're watching these videos, and so then they go through a longer term training, about 8 weeks, where they're trained in how to experience compassion and how to transform empathy into compassion. And then they watch a different set of videos, and they are asked to experience compassion during these videos instead of empathy. And what this research showed is that there was actually distinct brain networks, okay? So there was a different network observing the compassion experience versus the empathy experience. And the empathy overlapped with areas in the brain that are associated with processing pain, even physical pain. So when people were just in a state of empathy, it was as though they were experiencing or taking on that pain themselves, right? So just being in empathy alone was a recipe for sort of doubling the suffering in that situation. Now it's not just those that are in the video that are suffering. Now I'm also in distress. Whereas when they were asked to cultivate compassion for those in the videos, you see activation in areas of the brain that are associated with social connection and reward even. And consistent with this, what participants reported was when they were asked to just engage in empathy for the suffering of those in the videos, they self-reported more negative emotion at the end of the study. So after they got out of the scanner, they felt worse than before they went in after watching these videos. Whereas when they practiced compassion while they were in the scanner and they watched these videos, even though they were watching these really difficult to watch, challenging videos, they reported after coming out that they felt better. They actually felt more positive emotion, more connection. And that's consistent with the brain findings here, that there's activation in these reward centers. So compassion is actually this sort of mixed emotional state where it allows us to connect with the pain of others, but also have some positive emotion, a little bit positive emotion in the mix, this warmth that we were working to cultivate earlier through that spark, right? That kind of provides a little bit of a buffer, you could say, against the negative emotionality. So we can hold the pain, we can hold the suffering, but there's this natural boundary because we have this regulated state of warmth and care. And so that causes us to do less experience sharing and less just taking on the suffering of others. And therefore we can find that more optimal balance between emotional connection and emotional autonomy. Okay, so relates to that first question of what's the online difference between empathy and compassion. What about the downstream consequences of these different states? Okay, here again, researchers have found some really divergent consequences. So not just distinct brain networks, but in terms of what happens subsequent to that, in terms of its effects on our well-being and our health. Both empathy for suffering and compassion both start with empathy. Okay, so empathy is the starting point for compassion, and it's also the starting point here in this figure you can see for experiencing a kind of personal empathic distress. Okay, there are other options here, right? We could go down the middle or something like that. What is it that makes the difference in the divergence of these pathways from empathy to compassion versus empathy to empathic distress? Well, it has to do with how conscious we are. It has to do with how much we're willing to turn toward the suffering and also cultivate this sense of care and affection for those who are affected. And that results then in compassion being a more other-related emotional state, okay? When we're just in empathy alone and we encounter suffering, then the empathy happens to us. It kind of enters our system, the pain and suffering, and we might become personally overwhelmed ourselves. And so then it's a more self-related emotional state. We have to all of a sudden attend to ourselves because we're struggling too, right? And so then we have more negative feelings, more stress. And what researchers have shown is that that leads to poorer health and burnout over the long term. But interestingly too, empathy alone leads to, over the long term, less willingness to help, less effective help. So when we stay in the state of empathy, which is a less resourced, less conscious state, even though we're feeling what others are feeling, we're feeling with others, we're engaged with that suffering in one certain way, it actually leads to less likelihood to help. So compassion, on the other hand, other related emotion, positive feelings, okay, the sense of love, the sense of warmth, I called it, better health for us personally, right? And then interestingly, when we're engaged in this way, even though we're feeling better ourselves, we're still connected to that pain. We're still understanding and noticing the suffering of others. It leads to greater likelihood of helping others. So there's a bit of a paradox here. It's a good kind of paradox, I think. It's actually not a paradox, really. But I think one of the things that compassion teaches us is that there's this both and that's possible. That it's possible to be resourced ourselves and take care of ourselves and help others at the same time. It's not an either or dynamic where I have to sacrifice my own well-being in order to care for you. But actually there's this both and that's possible, where I can cultivate compassion, feel, connected to you, help you in ways that are skillful if help is needed or possible, and not lose myself in the process, not neglect myself in the process. All right, I'm gonna just pause here briefly and see if there's any questions, because I haven't done that yet in this portion.
Jordan, there was one question a little bit ago where someone said, is compassion more aligned with sympathy?
Yeah.
A few minutes ago, but letting you address that.
Right. Yeah, there's some fuzzy lines between these different concepts. Sympathy is more like, I know that you're going through some kind of pain, but I'm not feeling it with you. So it's a bit distinct. There's a kind of cognitive empathy and sympathy, but not this feeling with. I would say that compassion bridges that gap a little bit. We have both cognitive empathy and compassion in the sense that we know what others are going through. We're willing to look at that and think about that, but we also still do have this emotional connection and compassion. So sympathy can be a little more detached, like we send a sympathy card, but we ourselves are not sharing in the experience at all.
And there was a second question here. Would it be fair to say that clinical training programs are one route by which compassion may be taught? In other words, is compassion sort of an aspect of professional boundaries in the mental health world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes and no, I think, is the answer. So I work with and I do research on counselors who have training in compassion. And what this research suggests is when people have direct training in compassion, it helps them in the same way that we're working with the distinction between empathy and compassion. whereas counselors who do not have training in the distinction of empathy and compassion seem to struggle more with this in their work. And so even though they're getting trained in this kind of idea of professional detachment or non-attachment or something like that, and more not bringing the stuff home, they struggle more with that if they've not gone through some kind of more intentional practice with compassion. So compassion, I think, is a real resource that we should be training our professionals in. I'm especially working with mental health counselors, but I think in a variety of fields, this is needed to make it more conscious and to better care for those who are offering care. Okay, and this brings up this idea here of compassion fatigue, right? So maybe you've heard this term before. It's very common in helping professions. And what more recent research is suggesting is that it's not actually compassion fatigue. So the phenomena that is being described, the phenomenon that's being described by this label, compassion fatigue, is actually more consistent with the experience of empathy. So it's actually more something like empathic distress fatigue. So if we go back to this figure here, it's more that people are getting fatigued from this trajectory, from this less conscious pathway. Okay, whereas with compassion, there's actually usually a sense of energy. Now, it might not happen in the moment. We might still sometimes get sort of knocked off, kind of experience imbalance by different challenging situations. But there's greater resilience through compassion because we have this more conscious engagement with it. And empathy fatigue, interestingly, is not just the result of feeling with the suffering of others, but it also has to do with various attempts that we might make to dampen that experience in sort of misguided ways. So what compassion teaches us is actually the most skillful way of working with our empathy is one of embrace, of it's actually accepting that we're an empathic being and that we're going to feel what others are feeling, and that that's an inevitable part of our daily life. And once we accept that, then we can actually lean into it more consciously and work with it. Okay, so there's limitations actually in how much we can decrease the amount of empathy we're feeling. And so that's why it's not such a skillful thing to try and just suppress our empathy. It's actually irrepressible, or it's not possible for us to suppress it, and that's what research suggests. So it's going to be there either way, right? The question is, can we embrace it? Can we actually lean into it and become more conscious of it and use it to our advantage through the experience of compassion? So this raises this little avoidance paradox idea, which is that when we try and avoid something within our experience, if that's something like kind of natural to us, that experience is naturally happening to us, then we can actually create more of that thing. So I wanted to try this out in another experiential with you all right now. This one's much briefer, and it's kind of fun. So if you're willing again to kind of get ready for a little activity, kind of experiential. And I mean this sincerely, and what I'm about to ask, for the next 30 seconds or so, I'd like for you to try and not think of a white bear. Okay, so go ahead and sincerely try. Use whatever tools at your disposal. Try and not think of a white bear. Okay, we can stop here. Maybe you get the idea, or it's possible that you succeeded in not thinking about a white bear. And right now, as I'm speaking, a white bear is coming to mind very rapidly now because you succeeded in suppressing it for a period of time. So that's part of the paradox here of avoidance, is that even though we might succeed in the short term to avoid something experientially, like in this case, a thought that we didn't want to think, which is of the white bear, there's a rebound effect of that. So even if we succeed in the short term, then it tends to be that then that thing comes up more strongly later on, longer term. Okay. So this was originally brought up by the writer Dostoevsky, which I think I said that right. And if so, I've now made it through the hardest part of this lecture for myself. He said that try to pose here for yourself this task. This was all the way back in 1863. Not to think of a polar bear, and you will see that the cursed thing will come to mind every minute. Okay, so when we try and avoid the experience of suffering, when we turn the other way, when we engage in various kinds of numbing out or avoidance mechanisms, we're actually more likely to experience that thing again in the future. And so part of the brilliance of the sort of conscious response of compassion is this embrace of our empathy for suffering, or our embrace for the suffering that is alive within us. We're actually willing to hold that. We're willing to experience that. And as a result of that willingness, we are less likely to suffer in the future. We're actually cultivating a mindset that is going to be healthier longer term. And so this is that kind of courage of compassion. All right, let's see if I think I'm running low on time, so we'll skip past this little piece here. So again, the goal, right, is to experience this kind of state through compassion where we feel both connected to others and we feel this sense of boundary. And this pathway from fatigue to resilience, you know, what's making the difference here has a lot to do with the role of positive emotion. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk about through compassion training, we're working directly with the cultivation of a positive emotion. And research suggests that over time, this is going to allow us to build new social connections and resources for ourselves. So I don't have time to walk through the whole pathway here, but this is a really interesting theory that you might want to read about sometime if you've not heard of it before. It's called the broaden and build theory of positive emotion. And it tries to answer the question through an evolutionary psychology view. So a really sort of strict conservative view of human psychology tries to answer the question, what good are positive emotions? And what they find is that positive emotions serve certain key functions that actually allow us to grow our resources over time. And I mean that in a very literal sense. So it could be financial resources, it could be social resources like more connections with others, it could be more psychological resources. And so there's strong data to support the idea that practicing compassion will lead to an increase in our resourcefulness over time. Okay, and that resourcefulness doesn't just stay with us. This is a really cool study here that tracked people in a longitudinal study, I think over 10 years of time. And they found that people who were less lonely themselves were more likely to spread that sense of connection to those around them. And people that were less resourced themselves in one way or another, such as feeling loneliness, that also spread to those around them. So there's this kind of contagiousness of ourselves, in some sense. There's this kind of contagiousness of positive emotions like connection. So when we're cultivating loving kindness, when we're cultivating this feeling of compassion, there's this strong potential for it to really literally spread. And that happens through mechanisms that we could talk about, but it happens through mechanisms that we don't need to consciously think about. It's happening sort of automatically. And so if we ourselves are becoming healthier in these ways, more connected, then there's the possibility that we're already spreading more of this goodness for our communities, decreasing suffering for those around us. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. We don't need to get in this last part. My key lesson for this last thing is, yes, you know, that compassion can lessen empathy's downsides while preserving its upsides. So if you're someone out there who relates to the idea of being an empath, I know this came up in the small group I was in, you know, what does it mean to be an empath? Like, oh, I experience too much empathy. I believe that compassion training is a really good tool for that we can actually preserve what we like about being an empath, which is the sensitivity or attunement or more caring for others, while also decreasing the burden of that state, which is experienced as a kind of fatigue. So compassion allows us to be more resilient while also maintaining the things that are good about empathy.
Pardon?
Yeah. Oh, somebody have a question? All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Charlotta at this point to close this out. Unless there's some kind of pressing questions, I'm happy to answer too.
I'll just check the chat here, Jordan, for a second in case anyone has a question coming out of this presentation. And maybe while I'm waiting on that, I'll just put a plug in here. If, you know, Jordan's, I think, made a really good case for why practicing compassion and also training in compassion can be really helpful. And we do offer a compassion training program. It's called Welcome. It's the acronym, which is what we're offering in the Great Falls Public School District. So if any of you are interested in doing that, we have an online version of it. So I'll put my email in the chat here. So if you're at all interested or want to stay connected, feel free to reach out to me and I can let you know more about that. Okay, so I'll close us out here. Again, as I think Jordan highlighted, that we can have a conceptual understanding of compassion, and hopefully your brain, mine is always wonderfully full and spinning after Jordan shares his work and studies. But compassion is also something we can practice in terms of our own awareness and how we move through the world. And so we wanted to share with you in closing a very brief practice that's a compassion practice, or sometimes also called a loving kindness practice, that draws on a lot of the themes we've explored today, but lets you just feel into it yourself. So consider this like the dessert at the end of this training. So it's not like getting it right or getting it wrong or having to follow anything. So I'll invite you to be comfortable, whether that's sitting or if you want to lie down at this point. This is the beauty of Zoom realities. That's fine too. I'm going to guide you just briefly.
I would like to, yeah, I was just gonna say, I'd like to lie down.
Shelley, there you go. Okay. And Mary, just while people are getting situated, Mary, I see your note about trainings in other school districts and their staff. So reach out to Jordan and me and we can talk about that. Nothing's currently scheduled, but we're more than happy to discuss that if that's of interest to anyone or for your organization or community. Okay, so let's actually just start by letting go. You've been listening a lot. You've been taking in a lot. And the breath is really helpful here because we breathe anyway. So just let yourself breathe, maybe a nice few deep breaths. And relax any kind of tension, maybe tiredness you're feeling, anxiety of any kind. And this is just a short session of unwinding a bit. And now I'm going to invite you to bring into your mind a place that you love, or maybe a person, or an animal, an activity. It's like entering a space where you feel deeply comfortable, at ease, content, happy. Maybe it's from your childhood, a place you loved, or a friend you loved to be with, or a family member, or an animal. Maybe it's an activity. Some part of your life where you feel content and safe, at ease, where you feel held or supported in some way. And just imagine you're in this place or in this situation right now. Just feel what it's like. You can tap into the sense of ease or comfort. Basic sense of well-being. If you feel comfortable, you can put a hand on your heart and one on your belly, or just on your heart. Just feel your body breathing, feeling well as you imagine yourself in this place or space. And from this perspective of basic okayness, generate for yourself some wishes for well-being. Wish for yourself health. May I be healthy. May I be safe. May I be safe from harm. May I be happy. Just very simply offer yourself a wish to be happy. May I be well. May I be at ease in my life. If there are other words that come into your awareness, feel free to wish those for yourself. Generating basic sense of care and warmth towards this being that is you. And now we'll extend these wishes, the sense of warmth or wellness that you're feeling in this place or space of your memory. Invite someone else here, maybe someone you care for, someone you're close to. Feel them entering the space of basic warmth, space of wellness, goodness. Let yourself wish them well. May you be happy. May you be healthy. May you have ease in your life. And see who else comes into your mind. Someone else you can extend loving kindness towards. Maybe someone who was in the discussion group with you, whom you know or don't know. Here they are. They've shared these last couple hours with you. And send them wishes for well-being. May you be healthy. May you be happy. May you have ease in your life. And just let this sense of warmth and well-being and loving kindness, let it extend almost like rays of the sun out from you. We can bring all of us here in this call, in this workshop, into our awareness. Maybe extend to your community, those you work with, your family, friends. And sending out loving kindness to all of them. heartfelt wishes for their well-being. Those in particular who may be suffering or in pain or confusion right now. Maybe some of the people you work with. May you be healthy. May you be happy. May you have ease in your life. May you be free from suffering. Let any kind of efforting or visualization go. Feel your own body breathing as it does. Just right where you are. If you've been still in your body, go ahead and wiggle toes or shoulders, neck, hands. And before we close, I'll just plant a question, consideration as you think about going into the rest of your day, the people you're going to meet, encounter, be with, including yourself. Is there some seed of loving kindness you want to plant for yourself? Something you can do for another being, something for yourself. A small act of loving kindness or compassion. See if anything comes to mind. Okay, so thank you all so much for being with us today, and we wish you many blessings for your ongoing work and the vision of no more violence. May it be so. May it be so. And thank you again, Erin and Jamie, so much for your warm invitation and welcoming us to your community. And thanks, Jordan. Always a joy to do this with you.
Thank you both very much for being here with us. We certainly appreciate it. A final reminder to all those that joined us that we will have this presentation available next week on the YouTube channel at Alliance for Youth, and we will be sending out certificates of attendance next week as well. If you needed an OPI specific certificate, if you can email me directly at this point, that would be great. And thank you again, everyone. Jordan, there were some questions about your slides. Are those things you are comfortable sharing with us to send with the certificate?
I'm not able to share the full PowerPoint, but I'll share a resource guide that has some of the publications I cite and so on. Yeah.
That would be fantastic. And we'll send that out with the certificates as well then. Thank you so much, everyone.